Hello. I've got the next lecture I want to give to you here, and it ties into our previous one. We were talking about basic population growth, and now we'd like to sort of apply those ideas to the human population. And in this class, in Bio 101, we like to use ourselves as lots of examples for the things that we talk about so we can all relate to them. And the growth of the human population and its effect on other species is an important consideration, something we're going to be talking about a lot. So let's talk briefly about human population growth. You remember that we've got two basic models of population growth, the exponential and the logistic. And so the exponential is when the population just continues to grow, and it grows at an increasing rate. So the rate keeps getting faster and faster, and the population gets larger and larger. And a lot of populations start out this way because you've got basically a perfect situation, unlimited resources and things. But in reality, at some point, density-dependent factors start to kick in, and as the population approaches the carrying capacity, or K, then the rate of growth slows down. The population's still growing, but the rate of growth slows, but then it eventually stops and the population reaches carrying capacity. And so no population can grow forever. In reality, you can't maintain exponential growth on a finite planet. And humans are no exception. We're very different than other species, but ultimately we must conform to the same laws of nature as other species. And so here's a figure from your book showing human population growth over the last, and you can see that it looks quite a bit like exponential growth, right? That the population starts off growing, but it grows at a slow rate. And then the rate of growth increases, and consequently the population increases faster and faster. And you can see that just in the last few hundred years, a tremendous increase in human population. So this looks very much like exponential growth. But like we said, no population can sustain exponential growth, and we are no different. And so right now, as I'm giving this lecture, the size of the human population is more than 7 billion. In fact, it's approaching 8 billion. And even though if you look at that graph, it looks like exponential growth, we are seeing that the rate of growth has started to slow in about the 60s. So we are starting to see some of those density-dependent factors take in, or something is affecting the growth of the human population. Now, the population is still growing, it's just not growing as quickly as before. And so you have to keep that in mind. And even if the human population growth stopped and went to zero, that would still mean we've got a large population. And so the effects that we're having on the planet are not going to go away just because our population is no longer increasing. But it is still increasing. We haven't reached that point yet. So I've got a website here, and we're going to jump to that and just see how quickly the human population is growing at this point in time. So I just jumped onto that web page, and you can see the current world population is about 7.8 billion. And you can see how quickly it's ticking up. And if you look at the birth rate, the births today and the deaths today, you see that births are outnumbering deaths, and so that's why the population is growing. And this is an unimaginably huge number. Now, this is a graph of the annual percent increase in human population over the last few decades. And so you can see that the percent increase peaked in the 60s, and it has been declining. But again, that just means that we're still growing, we're just not growing as quickly. But when you've got a very, very large population, even slow growth, a low percentage growth of a large population is still a tremendous amount of growth every year. Now you'll recall with logistic growth that once you get closer to carrying capacity, the growth begins to slow, but the density continues to increase. And so although the population is not growing as quickly, it's still growing. And so although the human population rate of growth has begun to slow down, we still have a tremendous number of people on this planet, and it's still growing quite a bit. And so this is actually an old slide, because this slide says, we predict a global population of 7.8 to 10.8 billion people by 2050. Well, it's 2020 and we're at 7.8, so that low end is we've already hit that, and 30 years ahead of when it's predicted. So, but as we'll talk about here in a second, this is a hard thing to predict. It's a difficult thing to figure out what is the carrying capacity of humans. However, just because it's difficult to predict doesn't mean we are immune to the laws of physics and biology and to the laws of nature. We must conform to natural laws just like any other living species. And so, although we are different as a species, we still are limited just like other species. Now, we are unique. Obviously, we're unique relative to other species. And we're unique because we can understand population growth. Other species don't recognize how big their population is getting and don't understand the physics and the math and the biology behind it, but we do. And we have the ability to think about the future and to synthesize different forms of knowledge. Also, we're unique in that we have a very unique social structure. And so the effect on our population and what influences our carrying capacity is sociological as much as it is biological. Also, we have unique methods for extracting and using energy, whereas other species basically get their energy from the food they eat, maybe get some energy from the sunlight or from somewhat different sources. We have the ability to go and extract things like fossil fuels and extract energy or to build nuclear power plants. And so we have very unique ability to extract novel forms of energy, and we use that energy for other things beyond just staying alive. Well, that makes us very different, but that also means that we have a very different effect on the planet. And when we look at the humans, just like other populations, we can look at things at different levels. And so we were just talking about the global human population. But, humans, again, because of our social structure, we organize ourselves by political boundaries, right? And so we can talk about the population of the United States and the population of China, but we can also talk about the population of Kentucky or the population of Murray. So we can look at these at different levels and try to find out what things are important at different levels, but still, at some level, we behave like other biological populations, and we have a carrying capacity. And so understanding what influences that carrying capacity, well, that's critical to understanding human population growth. And it's true for any biological population. Understanding what contributes to carrying capacity, that's basic population ecology. Well, we're no different. You'll recall that there are things like density-dependent factors. And as the population becomes more dense, then these factors like disease and competition and wastes, they all become more important as the population becomes more dense, and they interact to set the carrying capacity. Well, humans are no different. And then what happens as the population approaches that carrying capacity? Those density-dependent factors kick in, birth rates decline, death rates increase, and that works to slow the growth of the population and eventually stops the growth of the population. And so what kind of things are going to influence human birth rates? Is it possible that food resources will get low enough that women won't be able to support, they won't be able to carry many children and support themselves? So will food limit birth rates in that way? That's a possibility. Will lack of food increase mortality rates? So will we start to run out of food and there'll be more starving? Is that something that could become more important as we approach carrying capacity? Will it be a combination of both? Might be, right? Is food and the availability of food going to, how is that going to influence birth rates and death rates, and how is that going to influence human populations? But of course, again, with our complex social structure and our different levels that we can, study human populations, this becomes even more complex, right? Because a lot of times when you have famine in a country, it's not because of, lack of agriculture. It's political. It's because some people control the food and keep it from other people. That's part of that complicated social structure that makes this a difficult question. To me, what's a bigger question is, what will the quality of life become before we get to this point? So, if we get to the point where food is limiting the birth rate or increasing the death rate, that's a horrible situation. But long before we get to that situation, what's the quality of life for the average human going to be like? And again, because we are unique in that we can think about the future and we can study history, this is a more acute problem for organisms like us. And so that's, again, a tough question. And so we can try to answer some of these questions and look at some of the data and see how we compare to other populations. We did say that the rate of growth is decreasing in the global human population. Well, is that because birth rates are declining? Or is it because death rates are increasing? Or is it some combination of both? Well, according to your book, the death rates are decreasing, and that's something that we have seen due to advances in medicine, better sanitation, things like that. So the death rate is decreasing. And so, the reason that our human population is slowing, the growth of our human population is slowing down, it's not because there are more deaths, there are actually fewer deaths. And a lot of that is concentrated at early infant mortality. And so you have a lot lower levels of infant mortality throughout the world. So that should cause the population to grow faster. So it's not death rates increasing, but birth rates are also decreasing. And so the birth rates are decreasing faster than the death rates are decreasing, and that's probably why the human population is still growing, but it's not growing as fast. But why are those birth rates decreasing? Why are we having fewer babies? Well, it's probably not due to lack of food. It seems like that we can produce tremendous amounts of food, and again, the availability of food is a socioeconomic problem, a political problem, so there's lots of complexity here, but it's probably not due to lack of food. So why are birth rates decreasing? Well, if you look at this figure from your book, it kind of suggests at some of the reasons. And so you can ask yourself, what influences, what kind of things seem to influence human growth? And now we're looking within different countries. And so we're looking at the populations at a different level. So in that middle graph in red, you see the population growth rate for different countries. And so that middle graph is organized from very fast growth at the bottom to actually shrinking populations. Germany's actually shrinking. So that's a place to start, right? And you can see where the United States is and where different countries are. And so then on the left here in green, you can see how those numbers relate to per capita income. And so as the per capita income tends to increase, you see population growth tends to decrease. So that's interesting. And so this is what I talk about, that sometimes it's more than a biology problem. It's a sociology problem. And it's an economic problem. And so in the countries that seem to have a higher income and you would expect a higher standard of living, those countries you see the population growth slowing in. But in your poorer countries, that's where you have lots of population growth. Then if you look on the right, you look at something like female literacy, the percent of the females who are literate. And again, you can see that as that number increases, population growth tends to slow. And in those countries where women don't have as much education, you tend to see more population growth. And so that's, tends to make you think that in those countries where, women have more opportunities, where women can work, where they have more education, they tend to choose to have fewer babies. And that is what's influencing the human birth rate. It's not necessarily starvation or a biological problem, but it's women choosing to not have as many babies, delaying reproduction until later, and then having fewer babies whenever they do have babies. That seems to be something very important to limiting the growth of the human population. So this is, kind of getting outside of the realm of biology, but this is the sort of things you can look at to try to figure out what is going to influence human carrying capacity. Now, we can try and ask ourselves, well, is there a point where food will become limiting? How much food is it possible to produce on Earth? It's a finite planet. You get a finite amount of sunlight every year. There's only so many places you can raise food. So there's a limit to how much energy can be used in biological processes. And so will that ultimately set our carrying capacity down the road? So there's a concept in ecology that we call net primary productivity. And so this is the amount of energy fixed by plants and available to other organisms. So all organisms require plants to capture sunlight energy, and then that energy gets passed from one trophic level to the next. Well, there's a limit to how much sunlight energy can be captured by these plants, and we call that net primary productivity. And so you can look at this and try to estimate, for the whole planet, how much net primary productivity is possible in a year. And based upon that number, you'd say that humans use about 1/3 of that total. And so does that mean then that theoretically we could support 3 times as many humans on this planet because we're only using 1/3 the available energy? Well, not really. It's not that simple, right? Other organisms need energy too. And so if all the net primary productivity went to humans, then no other organisms could survive. And that's not going to work because we need those other organisms as part of a functioning community of species. So using more, the net primary productivity is really not a great way to look at what's going to be the ultimate carrying capacity of humans. And energy is probably one of the most important things for us to look at, but we need more than just energy for life. We need things like clean water and clean air. And as the human population grows, those things become more and more scarce. So we're not necessarily going to be limited by the amount of net primary productivity. We're going to be limited by something else. But again, you can think that, you can relate this back to those density dependent factors we talked about. And as humans, we need energy for more than just biological processes like other species, right? We require or we expect a higher standard of living. So we need energy for habitation, right? We need to heat our houses and cool our houses. We don't need to cool our houses, but we'd like to cool our houses. To preserve the food, to harvest the food, that all requires lots of energy, extra energy. Humans, like to move around and travel and do things. There's all kinds of things that we as humans do that other species don't do, and all that requires energy. But that is not coming from net primary productivity. That's coming from mostly non-renewable sources, right? Fossil fuels. And so how are those things going to influence the carrying capacity of human beings? That's a tough question. And of course, all these are interrelated in complex ways. And so this, again, the take-home message is this is why it's hard to figure out what our carrying capacity is for human beings. So for example, we need other organisms. First, we need plants to capture that sunlight energy. We cannot exist unless those plants capture that energy, and then that energy gets passed to us. Either we eat the plant or we eat the animal that eats the plant. We need like wetlands and plants in wetlands. That's where a lot of our water gets cleaned, right? We need that clean water. Well, what's the easiest way to clean that water? You can use things like wetlands and plants that can clean water and clean and take things out of the air and take carbon dioxide out of the air. We rely on ecosystem services. So those organisms need some of that net primary productivity. Industrial energy use. Any kind of a factory or anything that we do that uses a non-renewable energy is going to pollute the water and the air. And so when we talk about density-dependent factors like toxins building up, we're talking for humans more than just the metabolites that come from the food we eat. We're talking about all these other things that are the byproduct of the Industrial Revolution. This is all really complicated. It's more than biology, yet it is all very important. So I think I made my point here. Determining the global carrying capacity for humans is tough. But in my opinion, a much more important question is, what is the quality of life as we approach carrying capacity? Long before that, starvation and things kick in, I think the quality of life of humans is going to decrease so much that we're going to be miserable. And we could argue that we're there now, but that, again, this is a tough question. But, how will that human population growth affect these other species and other species that we rely upon? That's an important question. How will different countries respond? Other countries that see an unfair proportioning of resources, they might not tolerate that for a long time. Here in the United States, we've got something like 5% of the world's population, and we use like 25% of the fossil fuels, or 25% of the energy. We are per capita responsible for much of the pollution as a country. Other countries aren't going to tolerate that. What's going to happen? How are they going to respond? What is the fairest way to partition the Earth's resources? Complicated questions that go beyond biology. However, we cannot escape the biology. This is something that we have to figure out. And so again, if you kind of look at this earlier graph that's talking about the different things that influence population growth, clearly, economics and education, ethics, morality, politics, all of that is really important to figuring out what our carrying capacity is and what's our life going to be like as we approach carrying capacity. But just as clearly, we can't pretend that it's not happening. We can't pretend that we are different than other species, and that that as we approach carrying capacity, we're not affecting other species in large and mostly irreversible ways. There are a lot of people that would like to deny that, but I think the evidence is fairly clear. And again, if you look at the growth of the human population and how other populations grow, you'll see that we all eventually reach that limit. These are questions that cannot be avoided. And so in future lectures, we're going to talk about some of these different ways that we are affecting the planet. But, this is not a side issue or something that academics or just biologists can worry about. This is something that is influencing all of us, and not just in this class, but in this whole planet. So the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can try and figure out what we're going to do about it, right? Anyway, that's all I've got for this topic right now. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about community ecology. We're going to talk about human effects in upcoming lectures. So let me know if you got any questions. And I'll see you later. See ya.